My name is Brandon Taylor, and I'm the founder of EmancipatED. Juneteenth is a unique opportunity for us to check in around emancipation and freedom in the United States. In so doing, I had the wonderful opportunity to talk to Dr. Stephen Hahn, Pulitzer Prize-winning history professor at NYU. I got to know Dr. Hahn through a partnership he has with my school, Dream Charter School, where he's been working directly with our students. The goal of EmancipatED is to provoke a conversation about freedom and what it means for Black and Brown people, and to orient educators towards the design and redesign of solutions that work towards that end. I hope you enjoy our conversation and walk away thinking about the following questions. What does it mean to celebrate Juneteenth? How did the formerly enslaved define freedom? And how does that influence how we define it today? And how did formerly enslaved people build their own institutions? And what does that mean for how Black and Brown people build their own institutions today? All right. Well, Dr. Hahn, we are so happy to have you and want to just ask you a few questions about emancipation, being that Juneteenth is coming up, and to just give us some guidance around what the formerly enslaved were processing, going through, thinking about leading up to Juneteenth and thereafter. So we just wanted to start with the question of, in what ways is Juneteenth similar to or different from other emancipation events like the Haitian Revolution?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I'm happy to be chatting with you. I think there's a certain amount of confusion about Juneteenth because Juneteenth isn't an emancipation event per se. It's a commemoration of the Union Army's arrival in Galveston, Texas in June 19th of 1865, and the announcement that emancipation had already arrived and the enslaved people in Texas were now free. Basically, why this event takes place is that the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, established that enslaved people in all of the rebellious states were free, but unless the Union Army was there to enforce it, it didn't really amount to very much. The Confederate Army surrendered in various ways at Appomattox and then in North Carolina, but they didn't surrender in Texas until early June. So whatever was true about the Emancipation Proclamation, because the 13th Amendment had not been ratified, it was the arrival of the Union Army that proclaimed freedom. So to that extent, it's not like the Haitian Revolution, because the Haitian Revolution involved emancipation in its process. And in effect, Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, was one of the many moments when enslaved people learned that owing to the war and to the defeat of their owners, they were free. Now, what happened was that there are many celebrations of freedom in different parts of the United States. A year later, in 1866, enslaved people in Galveston celebrated June 19th. Little by little, that kind of spread to other places, and eventually it became one of the commemorations that Black communities across the United States designated as a way to celebrate freedom. Eventually, many of the states, as well as the District of Columbia, proclaimed this a special holiday commemorating emancipation. But the emancipation event itself was the Emancipation Proclamation and then the 13th Amendment, which at that point had not yet been ratified.
So in many ways, Juneteenth is not an emancipation event.
It's a celebration of emancipation.
Excellent. And there, in many ways, the Emancipation Proclamation also wasn't an emancipation event because it required
exactly
the enforcement of the Union Army.
I mean, it was an emancipation event legally, but it wouldn't amount to anything. First of all, if the Union Army hadn't defeated the Confederacy, it would have been moot because it only applied to those states that were in rebellion against the United States and therefore did not abolish slavery in numbers of other places. And since it had to be announced and enforced by the United States, it was an event. And this was going to be true for the 13th Amendment as well. But of course, at that point, the Union Army was an army of occupation across the South. And therefore, once the 13th Amendment was ratified, not only was that proclaimed, but it also was proclaimed in places where the Emancipation Proclamation did not really figure, places like, say, Kentucky, which had not joined the Confederacy, but had not abolished slavery on its own. So one of the ironies of emancipation is that a state that refused to join the Confederacy was one of the last places where slavery existed. It existed there longer than any place else.
Wow. And as we're thinking about the formerly enslaved and their perceptions of freedom, there was what the government, I guess, granted an end of slavery, but that's not necessarily how they perceived what freedom to be. So how did the formerly enslaved people define freedom?
Well, as you can imagine, enslaved people thought about freedom in a whole variety of different ways, oftentimes reflecting their own personal and family experiences. Obviously, it meant escaping from under the thumbs of their owners. It involved being able to exercise mobility, being able to reconstitute their families and communities on a new basis, being in charge of themselves, being able to govern themselves, being able to work for themselves, being able to at least be paid for the work that they did. I think for many enslaved people, particularly those who were in agricultural areas, it meant getting access to land, because that was the best way of escaping the power and dependency that slavery and other forms of even wage labor might entail. To the extent that they had any resources, they tried to pool those resources to get access to land. It was a very difficult struggle. And as we know, in some areas like the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, Sherman's field order reserved many thousands of acres of land for Black settlement. Now, this was eventually overturned, but it did enable quite a number of formerly enslaved people to kind of stake claims. And it was one of the areas in the South where it was a pretty significant level of Black land ownership.
So to an extent, the government and the formerly enslaved defined freedom as having some degree of land ownership.
Well, I think there were people within the government who recognized that freedom without economic independence was very precarious. And therefore, enslaved people who thought that and thought that they had a right to the land because of their many, many years, generational years of labor and the wealth that they provided for their owners and for the country as a whole, entitled them to claims, and they had allies in the federal government. The problem was they didn't have enough allies in the federal government to do that. And once Lincoln was assassinated and replaced by Andrew Johnson as president, who was not sympathetic to the freed people, it's not entirely clear how sympathetic Lincoln would have been on this issue. But Johnson was not sympathetic to the freed people. He was more sympathetic to the former owners, and he played a direct role in making sure that those, the initiatives that were taking place by the federal government were rolled back.
And in thinking about you brought up this point about without economic independence, freedom is precarious.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk a little bit more about how the formerly enslaved work towards economic independence, and any movements or efforts for economic independence?
Well, while they were enslaved, many of them had access to provision grounds, which they could work in their spare time, such as it was, and where they could grow crops or raise livestock for their own consumption, and in some cases for sale. So they had, certainly understandings about the relationship between access to land and their own subsistence. And some of them had, pretty good understandings about how market exchanges worked as well. I think what happens once slavery ends is that the first thing many formerly enslaved people do is to gather family members and others who were part of the communities that formed under slavery to together try to find work arrangements as free people. For the most part, because they didn't really have resources to buy land, they had to enter into labor contracts and try to do the best they could to receive wages that they thought were adequate and protections that they thought were necessary. In some cases, slaves had enough resources to pool so that they might be able to purchase land, or at least to rent land, which meant that they would have much more control over their day-to-day lives and over the control of the crop. Sharecropping was more like wage labor. They were effectively paid in a share of a crop. If they rented land, they had much more control, and therefore it was much more desirable. But in order to rent land, they needed resources, they needed mules, they needed supplies, and relatively few of the formerly enslaved were able to do that. So this is a moment, during the latter phases of the war and the early phases of the post-war period, when there are possibilities of real land reform in the South, which would have made an enormous difference. But those possibilities were closed down for a variety of reasons, not least was the importance of cotton to the American economy, and concerns that if formerly enslaved people had their own land, they'd grow food, not cotton, and the American economy might suffer.
And so how did the formerly enslaved respond to these challenges with procuring land? Like, something that's coming to mind is Marcus Garvey and attempts to immigrate in order to have land.
Right. Well, they move on a number of fronts. I mean, one thing that they could do fairly quickly is to try to use whatever leverage they could to gain labor contracts that gave them better wages or shares of the crop. And in some cases, they were able to do that by withholding their labor and forcing owners to basically concede some of what they wanted. Then, once the elective franchise is extended to African-American men, they're able to mobilize politically. And a lot of the areas where there were large numbers of formerly enslaved people, suddenly they have real political power. The Republican Party, that was in power nationally, saw the formerly enslaved people, now freed people, as really a political base in the South, probably the only reliable one that they had. And in many places, for a number of years during Reconstruction, free people were able to not only to vote, but to elect members of their own communities to local office, to state legislatures, in some cases the Congress, where at least they were able to mitigate some of the most repressive laws that former Confederates wanted to bring down against them, and to see if they can provide better circumstances for themselves. They were able to serve on juries. They were able to rein in violence and other forms of coercion that their former masters try to bring against them. And in some places, like South Carolina, they try to set a basis to enables free people to gain some access to land. In South Carolina, they organized a land commission, which meant that if white landowners were unable to pay their taxes, the land would be basically taken possession of and divided up into smaller parcels. You know, it didn't have an enormous effect on Black land ownership. Over time, struggling, and over many years, more and more black people were able to buy land, small amounts of land. It happened in the Upper South. It happened in parts of the Deep South. By 1910, this is sort of the high point of Black land ownership in the post-war period. But as you were saying, one of the things that comes up on the table as a way of trying to secure a freedom that they thought made sense to them was to leave the South, to emigrate elsewhere. They thought about the possibility of gaining land in the Trans-Mississippi West, which was under federal jurisdiction and still not divided up entirely into states. And some of them thought about emigrating to Liberia, because this was a place they knew about, because the American Colonization Society, since the early 19th century, was enabling freed slaves to go there if they chose. And there was already settlements of American-born Black people who were there. And for a time, the American Colonization Society had the resources to basically pay their way over there and give them access to land. Little by little, this became more and more difficult. But there's no question that information about this spread very widely, interest in this spread very widely, and therefore you can kind of get a sense of the sources of a developing popular Black nationalism, a kind of community building sentiment based around ideas of Black empowerment, based on ideas about Black solidarity, based on recognitions that they had very few white allies, and the only way that they could establish some semblance of freedom that, you know, involves security and some idea of a decent future was by looking inward, not by trying to form the kind of political alliances that were more true of Reconstruction, which involved alliances with white Republicans nationally and white Unionists in the South, insofar as they were there.
So it sounds like as time was going on, there were new and emerging ideas of what freedom looked like and what freedom should look like for Black people. And
whether you could have freedom in the South.
And whether you could have freedom in the South or in the country, it seems.
And well, you know, certainly as you can imagine, in the 20th century, migrating out of the South into the North, you eventually into the urban North, what we call the Great Migration, certainly became one of the possible and an avenue where millions of African Americans set out. You know, sometimes they first move from the rural South to the urban South, and then from the urban South to the urban North. And there were all sorts of chains of migration, family members who went and others followed. But this certainly was the great shift of Africa. You know, at the turn of the 20th century, still 90% of Black people were in the southern states. And, you know, by 1930 and 1940, that had decreased substantially. The majority was still there, but more and more African Americans are in places like, you know, Chicago and Pittsburgh and New York and Philadelphia, beginning in the 19 teens and extending into the post-World War II period.
So I just want to take this moment to consider the long history that we've just discussed, right? We've started by talking about the Emancipation Proclamation through Juneteenth to this Great Migration, and having us think about the ways in which people of color, Black people specifically, saw freedom in this country and the ways in which they strive to create a more free society for themselves. And so just want to thank you, Dr. Hahn, for just answering some of these questions and just helping us to just think more broadly around what emancipation should look like today. I think Juneteenth is a really great opportunity for people of color in this country to check in around emancipation and see
Exactly, to explore their own histories.
Right. And to see to what extent we can celebrate and where do we need to push further. So just want to thank you again and look forward to
Thank you. Pleasure.
sharing this.